Okay, so in this video we're going to take a look at how to handle a round trip from Lightroom to Photoshop and back to Lightroom again. So in order to do this smoothly and efficiently and with your choices in mind, we need to set up both softwares in order to be able to do this. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go into the preferences in Lightroom and make sure it's set up the way we would like it to be set up. So if we go to Edit and Preferences, and I believe on a Mac it's into Lightroom and Preferences, and we get this box pops up, we are going to be looking in the External Editing tab. So this first section here is what happens to an image that goes into Photoshop. This section here is what happens to an image when it goes into any other external editor. So we're not going to be looking at this section today, only the first section. So you have some choices in here. The file format is the first one. You can use TIFF or PSD, and that will tell Lightroom that you want to take a raw image, take it into Photoshop as a TIFF or a PSD. So the choice is yours. You can use a regular PSD or you can use a TIFF. Now I do believe that with a PSD the largest document size is 2 gigabits, where with a TIFF you can go up to 4 gigabits. So for this I'm going to select a TIFF. The colour space, Lightroom works with ProPhoto RGB, so the more sensible choice here would be to use ProPhoto RGB. You can get away with using Adobe RGB. sRGB is the smallest colour space, which you would use for online, and it's absolutely fine to use ProPhoto RGB because you can convert to sRGB when you export images. So we're going to leave it set to ProPhoto RGB. You have a bit depth choice of 8-bit or 16-bit. I choose to use 16-bit. Add a resolution of 300, and I'm going to compress the file. That will give us save a little bit of space on the hard drive, because a TIFF file can get quite large when you're building and using layers within Photoshop. The only thing in this box that's of any further importance is down here, where it says stack with the original. You want to make sure you have a tick in that box. That will enable Lightroom to put the PSD or the TIFF file back into exactly the same folder and stack it side by side with the original raw image. So make sure that you have that box ticked and you have to say OK. These changes will not apply until you restart Lightroom. So you could either select to hit OK and then exit Lightroom, do a backup and go back in again, or you can just select restart Lightroom Classic from this box here, and it will relaunch with those new saved settings in place. So because I've already had them saved, I'm just going to hit the OK. So now we have Lightroom set up. We're going to pop over to Photoshop and we'll do the same thing. We are going to come into the Edit tab up here and down to Colour Settings. So that will bring up this box here now, and if we take a look in the settings here, you will probably have something like European General Purpose 3 as the default, and we're going to come down and look in the working space. So by default I believe Photoshop has sRGB. So you want to come into this drop down box and you want to select ProPhoto RGB, and if you can't find ProPhoto in this list anywhere, if you go to select Load RGB, and that will bring up another box, you should be able to find ProPhoto in there somewhere. So you want to have ProPhoto RGB. The next three down are not important. As photographers, you won't be using that, so we'll just leave them as the default. When you come down to management policies, in the RGB tab, you want to, if we select the drop down, you have three choices: off, preserve embedded profiles, or convert to work in RGB. If we select convert to work in RGB and you bring an image into Photoshop that doesn't have a ProPhoto RGB profile, it will convert it to whatever working profile you have selected up here, and we have selected ProPhoto RGB. If we leave it as preserve embedded profiles, it will use the embedded profile that is within the image. So we are just going to come down here and we're going to select convert to working RGB profile. We're going to leave these for the time being, these boxes under here ticked. That is going to tell Photoshop that when we bring in an image that doesn't have ProPhoto RGB as a working profile, it's going to ask, what do we want to do with it? Do you want to convert it, or do you want to leave it as it is? So you get a choice at the time. If that is annoying to you, you can come back in here and you can disable these little checkpoints here. On the right hand side, we won't be making any adjustments in here, but instead of just hitting OK there, sometimes when you have to reinstall Photoshop, it asks you if you want to preserve current settings. So if you hit the save button here, then you can see I've already saved my settings as Mary's colour settings, and it asks you down here to give it a title, and as soon as you hit save, it will give you a little box so you can come in here and you can type in and give it a little bit of a description if you choose to. So I'm just going to hit cancel there because I've already saved mine, and you can see up here it says Mary's colour settings, so I'm just going to hit OK at that point. So I'm going to pop back over to Lightroom here, and we're going to look at different ways to take an image into Photoshop and the reasons for using the different ways to do it. So if I take this first image here, and I'm going to right click, and I can right click on the image here and go to edit in Adobe Photoshop, or I can right click down on the thumbnail in the film strip. It doesn't matter, you get the same menu for each one. So if I choose edit in Adobe Photoshop, you can see down here that I have another choice. I can open as a smart object in Photoshop. The panorama or HDR it's grayed out at the moment. That will only be an option if you have multiple photographs selected. And if we just say, for example, if I pop down here and I highlight 2 photographs in the film strip, and I go back to edit in photographs, then you can see I have open as layers in Photoshop. So we're going to ignore the panorama and HDR today, and we're just going to be looking at edit in Adobe Photoshop 21, open as a smart object in Photoshop, and open as layers in Photoshop. So if I wanted these 2 images that I've got highlighted here to go into and create one image in Photoshop, one TIFF file or PSD in Photoshop, and I want them in the same image but as 2 separate layers, then I would use open as layers in Photoshop, but we're not going to do that at this moment in time. So I'm just going to right click on this bird of prey image. I'm going to say edit in Adobe Photoshop, and I'm going to say edit with a copy of Lightroom adjustments. So if this had been a raw file and I'd brought it into Lightroom and I'd made all my adjustments to it, then I would select to edit a copy with Lightroom adjustments and I hit OK. if Photoshop wasn't already open on the computer, that would launch Photoshop. And if I come over here now and give it a second, there the image is. We've loaded it into Photoshop and it's there with one single layer, and it's just a regular pixel layer. If I pop back over to Photoshop now and I right click on the same image and I go to edit in and I choose to open this as a smart object in Photoshop, and I'm going to show you the reasons for doing this. So if I pop back over to Photoshop now, you can see that I have two separate images here of exactly the same bird. But if I look in the thumbnails, this one is just a regular image, regular pixel image. If I come to this one, you can see that there's a little icon in the bottom right hand corner of the thumbnail, and that's telling me that this is a smart object. So why the difference? Why would we use a smart object as opposed to a regular one? Say for example you were going to resize this image and you're going to use it in a composite. This thumbnail here with in the smart object, if I double click into this thumbnail now, that will now launch me into Camera Raw. And I can re-edit. If I'd done any edits on this image in Lightroom, it would show me where the sliders were, and will demonstrate that in one of the other images that I bring in. But I can make adjustments to this image here if I choose to. But I'm going to cancel that for now because I don't need to do that. If I come back to the original regular pixel layer image, and I'm just going to unlock this and make it into a regular layer, and I'm going to hit Ctrl and T to get the bounding boxes up, and I'm going to hold my shift key and I'm going to drag this image down and make it really small, and I'm going to hit the enter key. I'm going to come back over to the smart object one. I'm going to hit Ctrl and T again, and I'm going to drag that down and resize it and hit the enter key. So if I come back over to the regular image and I hit Ctrl and T again and I resize this back up, look what's happened. The image is totally destroyed. I can't use it anymore. It's absolutely useless because I've resized it. If I had just resized it down, so if I hit Ctrl and Z and undo that, and I hit Ctrl and T again, I can carry on doing this and resizing it, but as long as I don't hit the enter key, it's fine. But if I resize it down and hit the enter key and then hit Ctrl and T again and try and resize it back up, it's totally destroyed. We can't use that image anymore. But if I come over to the smart object image and I hit Ctrl and T, after we've hit enter, I can resize that image and it's absolutely fine. It hasn't lost any detail at all. The only time it would lose detail if I try and make it much bigger than it actually was, but I would actually have to take it to quite some size before it would start to lose detail. So as long as I am just taking it back to the size that it was originally when I brought it into Photoshop, it's going to be perfectly fine. It's reusable. I can resize it up and down as many times as I like, and it will not affect how the image is ending up. It's going to stay perfect. So I'm going to close these two images because I don't need to use those anymore. And I'm going to pop back over into Lightroom. So now we're going to take this landscape image in, and we're not here to judge these images. These are just all in a training catalogue that I use, and they all have issues, so we're not judging the photography here. They're just being used for training purposes. So if I right click on this image and I go to edit in, and we are going to edit as, open it as a smart object in Photoshop. And we'll give that a second to open because they're quite large files. Okay, so now this has opened in Photoshop, and we can see that it is a smart object because in the layer thumbnail we have the smart object icon. So if I double click into this image here and give it a second, this opens me up into Camera Raw. Now if you take a look at the settings here in Camera Raw, so highlights are -69, tint is +18. So these are the adjustments that I had made in Adobe Lightroom. So if I pop back over to Adobe Lightroom and take this image into the develop module, you can see there are the adjustments that I had made to this image. So popping back over to Photoshop, Camera Raw recognizes that those adjustments were made. It runs off exactly the same engine, so it's linked in and the settings are baked in. So I can still come in here and make changes to this image from here, but I'm just going to cancel that because I don't want to do that at the moment. But this is quite a good reason why you could bring an image into Photoshop. This is something I would do in Lightroom, but I'm just going to do a quick demonstration on how and why you could use it and bring it in as a smart object. So if I right click on this layer and I go to new smart object via copy, that now gives me two layers and they are both smart objects. So we know with a smart object we can go back into Camera Raw. So if I double click on here and take this image into Camera Raw, and we're going to make some adjustments to the sky, and it's a good image to just demonstrate this on. We're not bothered about what it's going to do to the snow because we're going to add a mask onto it. We're only looking at what it's going to do to the sky. So say for example I bring the exposure down on the sky and I warm it up just so that it's completely obvious what we've done to this image, and give it a little bit more texture and possibly dehaze it a little bit so it's blatantly obvious what we've done. And we're going to hit OK. So once that renders down, that's made that adjustment to the whole image, but we don't want it to apply to the ground level. So we're just going to come over, click on the add layer mask icon, and we're going to select the brush tool, hitting the letter B, and we need we can see we've got our default colors. If I hit D for default colors and then X to make black as the foreground, and I'm just going to use a very large soft brush, and I'm just going to paint that effect very quickly off the bottom end of the image there. That's it, that will do absolutely fine. So the idea now is to take this image back into Lightroom with the ability to come back in and re-edit these layers in Photoshop if you want to do something with them. So in order to save this on a Mac, you would hit Command and S or Control and S on a PC, or you just come up to File and Save. Now I'm only going to use the save. I am not going to select the save as, because that would then ask me if I want to go and take this image and save it out on into a file on my hard drive. I don't want to do that. I want this to end up in my Lightroom catalogue. And because it came from Lightroom, if I just choose to save now and I flip back over to Lightroom and I give it a minute to save that image, if I look back in Photoshop, you can see it's just 95%, it's just finished there. And now if I go back into grid mode, hitting the G key in Lightroom, now you see I have two versions of this landscape image. I have one of two, which is the one that we've just edited in Photoshop, and I have two of two, which is actually the original. Don't ask me why it doesn't do that the opposite way around, but I have no idea. So the original, if we look at the file name down at the bottom here, so the one we've just had in Photoshop with the darkened sky has the camera's original file name with the .tiff on the end. If I look at the original, that is an NAF file, so I shoot Nikon, so that is NAF is the raw version out of a Nikon camera. So we have those two versions, and if you remember, we opened this first one as a smart object in Photoshop. So just say, for example, I've decided, oh, that sky's a little bit too bright, and I've done that in Photoshop. I want to go back into Photoshop now to re-edit this image. So if I right click now and I go to edit in, I'm not going to make it a smart object because we did that the first time round. So I'm just going to choose edit in Adobe Photoshop 2021. Now I get these choices again. So this is the point that you really need to remember. The first time we took this image in, we didn't get this choice because we asked Photoshop to open it as a smart object. So took that raw file, embedded it in a smart object and opened it in Photoshop. This time we don't want to edit with a copy of the Lightroom adjustments as we did with the bird of prey image. We want to edit the original, right? And the original is not this original that we brought into Lightroom as our raw file. The original we are talking about is the original TIFF file that we created when we went into Photoshop. So the other option here is to edit a copy, and if I edit a copy, it will create yet another version of this TIFF file. If I edit the original, it will take this original and take it back into Photoshop with the layers intact for us to edit on. So if I just choose edit the original, and it will pop me back into Photoshop, and there we go, it's opened up with our layers and our mask, and we can carry on in here and we can do yet another so let's just put a levels adjustment layer on there, just so we've got another layer added to it. And then if I hit file and save, or command and S, control and S, it will take us back into Lightroom. And you see, because we re-edited the original, we still only have the two copies. So let's try that with a copy. So if I right click on this image again and I say edit in Adobe Photoshop, if I want to edit a copy, because I might want to try a different version, I'm going to say edit a copy, and that will launch us back into Photoshop. And say, for example, so you see we've got our three layers here. So if I just do put a black and white, no, I put a photo filter on, we'll just control and Z and undo that. I am going to choose black and white conversion. There we go. So now we've got another layer on there. And now if I hit File and Save and come back over into Lightroom, give it a second to render that down, and we should get a black and white conversion. There you are. So now we have the three images here. So you need to have a think about when it asks you if you want to edit the original, it is talking about the original TIFF file. When we took this bird of prey in, we hadn't had it into Photoshop before, so we wanted to edit the original Lightroom version with the Lightroom edits on it. So they're the points that you have to think about when going from Lightroom into Photoshop. The one big mistake that you could make here is if you wanted to take one of these TIFF files and you want to go back to edit in Adobe Photoshop, if you choose to edit with a copy of Lightroom adjustments, it will open this image in Photoshop, but it will flatten the image out. You will not have your layers here. So I'll just demonstrate that. So I'm taking this black and white TIFF file, so we knew we had about 4 layers in there. If I edit with a copy of Lightroom adjustments and select edit and go back into Photoshop, I still had that image open. So sorry, I'll have to close out of that image and come back into Lightroom, select edit in Adobe Photoshop, edit with a copy of Lightroom adjustments, and go back in. There we are. It's actually flattened the image out, so we don't have the ability to go back into those layers and make other adjustments. It's flattened the image out. So it's a good point to remember. That is the important thing. So I'm just going to, and if you did do that and you realized your mistake, if you don't save the changes there, then you should be able to take it back in from Lightroom. So let's see if that works. So if we go edit in Adobe Photoshop and we edit the original raw file, it might have already flattened it. We'll sharp find out. There we go. Yeah, so as long as we hadn't done any work there, it didn't flatten the image because we didn't save it. Yeah, if we had saved it before we escaped, then we would have had a problem. It would have flattened the image and we wouldn't be able to get back into it there. Okay, so let's just close that image and pop back over to Lightroom. Now, some people take images, raw images, directly from their folder on the hard drive into Photoshop, and they don't take them there directly from Lightroom. So Lightroom doesn't realize that that photograph actually exists, even if the original photograph is in the Lightroom catalog. So let's take this image here, for example. And if I right click on this landscape image and I say show in Explorer, it's going to open up the Explorer on the hard drive and show me the actual image in the folder where it resides on my hard drive. And apologies, this is a bit slow when I'm recording video. Not usually quite that slow, but there we go. So here we are. It's got the image highlighted down at the bottom of the screen here. So if I right click on this image and say open with Adobe Photoshop, and we'll give it a second to open up there. There we are. So because it was a raw file, it's opened it straight into Camera Raw. Now if you wanted to work with this raw file as a smart object, as we had done in the previous one, if we look down at the bottom right hand side, this says open at the minute. So this would open this image in Photoshop just as a regular layer, not as a smart object. But if we hit the shift key, you can see that open changes to open object. So we're going to click on open object. It's going to tell us, because we asked Photoshop to tell us when we're going to open an image that doesn't have the ProPhoto RGB profile. So I'm just going to tell it to convert the document to the colours in our working space choice. So now we have, if we look on the thumbnail of the pixel layer, we have a smart object. So again, if I right click and choose new smart object via copy, we can double click on that smart object via copy and go back into Adobe Camera Raw. So again, we're going to just do a quick edit here for the sky. We're going to take that exposure down and give it a bit more texture, make it a little bit more blue, just so that we can see the difference on the edit. And we'll probably bring up the shadows, and we're only looking at the sky here, so we're going to hit OK. And again, that's rendered down. We're going to quickly just stick a mask on, and we're just going to come in and brush that edit off the land. And you can see why this is a chuck away image, because if we look down at the bottom right hand corner there, we've got a little blot on the landscape. We've got somebody's head in there, and yes, you could clone that out, but I just repositioned the camera and took it without that distraction in. So now if we go save and save as, and we're going to save this back, we're going into the original folder where it was, where the original raw file was, and we'll just call this landscape 1, and we're going to save it as a TIFF file, and we're going to hit save. So we're going to save it as non-compressed and hit OK, and it's going to tell me if I'm saving the layers, it's going to make a larger file size. I'm happy with that. So now we've taken this photograph from our folder on our hard drive into Photoshop. We've done some edits, created some layers, and we've saved it back to the folder. Lightroom doesn't realise this photograph exists. So if I pop back over to Lightroom, Lightroom has the original raw file in, but it doesn't know that that new TIFF file that we just created exists. So if I ask Lightroom where is this photograph, and I'll look in the metadata tab, and it tells me, if I go and click here, it tells me it's in odd photos. So I need to bring in the photograph that we've done edits on, and you can see one that I've done here previously, but that is called test, and we called our new one landscape image. So if I right click on this folder and I say Synchronize folder, it's going to take a look in the folder on the hard drive and say what has changed, and it tells me, oh look, there's 2 photographs have changed in that folder. Would you like to import them? I have a tick in the box to say yes, and I'm going to hit Synchronize. It's going to take a look in that folder, and it's going to, if we look at the top, it's synchronizing the folder, and it's going to bring in the new edit. So give it a second, it's importing the files at their current location. It's going to leave the images in there, in that folder, and just bring them into the Lightroom catalogue. There we go. They are the 2 images that Lightroom didn't realise, and that is our image that we've just created. If I look at the file name down at the bottom, it says landscape. So now the Lightroom catalogue knows that image exists in the folder on the hard drive, and we can take that image back into Photoshop. So if I come back over to the collection that I was working in, and we have our images back here, the only other thing we haven't talked about is taking images in, multiple images in. So we have an image of Bamborough Castle here, and we have an image of one of my dogs playing in the sea. So if I select both of these images by control and clicking on both of them, or shift clicking, and I right click and say edit in, we want to make a choice, edit in Adobe Photoshop. If I do that, it will open two separate images as regular pixel images. I can open them as layers in Photoshop, and if I'll quickly make that choice now, and we'll open them up and give it a second to render them down, and there you go. So we have the two images in Photoshop as two separate layers. So if I wanted to go and make selections and blend those images together, then I could quite happily do that. I don't want to do that in this instance, so I'm just going to close and not save the changes, and I'm going to close that image because I don't need that. I've flipped back over to Lightroom again, and I'm going to say right click and say edit in. If you remember, if I choose to edit in Adobe Photoshop, it will just open these as two regular pixel layer images as separate individual photos, but I want to open them as a smart object in Photoshop. So we'll look at the reason why we're going to do that. So if I say open them as a smart object and I flip back over to Photoshop, you can see it's opened them as two separate images here, but they are both smart objects. So if I take this image here and I just do a really quick selection, and I say select subject, I'm just going to make a really rough cutout here, and that's absolutely fine. I'm just going to add a little bit more in because it's missed a bit there. Right, so we're not talking about the selection, so I'm not going to waste any time refining it. So I'm going to, with the selection active, I'm just going to pop over here and click on the mask icon. That will give me a cutout. I'm going to pop up and select my move tool, and I'm just going to click and drag this up and drop it down into my image here. He's way too big, so if I hit Ctrl and T to get the bounding boxes, and I'm going to just drag him down, pop him in here, drag him down a little bit more, maybe he's a bit more, make him a bit smaller. That's it. We'll just change his orientation, and I'm just going to select the mask quickly with a black brush, and we just need a small brush, so I'll just pop up here quickly and size the brush, and it just has to be a soft brush, yeah. And I'm just going to quickly come over and just take that hard edge off the bottom there. And this is not about doing composites, it's really a rough guide on why we're using a smart object. So I've taken him from this other image, cut him out, dragged him in, dropped him in as a separate layer, but you can see still a smart object. If I double click on this smart object thumbnail, and that should eventually open us up in Camera Raw, and I can just take down his exposure. I'll just taken down quite drastically, so it's obvious to see the difference, and hit OK. So now you can see by taking a look at him here that we've been able to go back into the raw file and make an adjustment on him. He's way too dark there, so we'll double click again and go back in when it's ready, and we'll just increase that exposure a little bit, and we'll give him a little bit more texture. Yay. Hit OK, and the changes are made. So now all I have to do is come up and say File and Save, and when that is finished saving, we can pop back over to Lightroom, and there we are. There is our image with the layers, with the dog playing around in the field of beautiful purple flowers. Well, it's not purple flowers, it's a crop of some kind, but I don't know what kind it is. I know that was an awful lot to take in, but I hope you can take it one step at a time and look at the different reasons why you want to take an image into Photoshop, what you're going to do with the image once you get it into Photoshop, and how to save it back out into your Lightroom catalogue. Remembering that each time you create a TIFF, you are producing another file to go into your hard drive. So, and they are quite large files, so you need to be aware of the fact that the more layers you have, the bigger the file it is. Okay, I think that just about covers all of that, and thank you for watching. As usual, if you have any questions, just pop them in the comments box down below and I'll see if I can answer them for you. Okay, thank you.